Welcome to the Profile Corner. Today's video is part 3 in the Introduction to Radial Arm Saws video series. Today we'll be talking about using dado blades on radial arm saws. I had previously mentioned some things that you'd want to look for a dado set for a radial arm saw, and those include a negative hook angle. What I'd like to do is start out with the dado blade that came with a Craftsman radial arm saw that I bought in 1990. I bought it used. It came with a nice dado blade for the radial arm saw. This is similar to the dado blade that Norm Abram used on the new Yankee Workshop in the first season of that show. This is what's called a wobble dado. It's made up of a single saw blade that has a very aggressive hook angle. When I got the radial arm saw, I never actually used this dado blade. I had used a blade similar to this in the 1980s on a table saw, and I found this style of blade was incredibly hard to use. It leaves kind of a scooped bottom in the cuts that it makes. And it's also very hard to figure out exactly what width the blade is going to be cutting, because you have to rotate this blade essentially 180 degrees to measure the one side of the cut and compare it with the other side of the cut. So that makes it kind of difficult to get a good idea of how wide of a dado cut you're going to be making. And in addition to that, of course, the scalloped bottom in the cut was not suitable for any exposed joinery. So the previous owner of the saw obviously used this blade because I can see that there's still some pine pitch on the teeth. In my opinion, it would be crazy to use one of these saw blades on the radial arm saw because of the aggressive hook angle of the teeth, among other factors that I've already talked about. Okay, so I didn't use this saw blade to make dado cuts on the radial arm saw, so what did I do? And in the 1990s, I bought a Craftsman set of dado blades. This was kind of an expensive set, made in the United States, has all carbide teeth, and I use this extensively. It makes flat bottom grooves, which is something that's not common with today's dado blades, but that also means that it leaves a little bit of a rough cut when you're cutting plywoods with thin veneers, such as birch plywood or oak plywood. This dado stack was a pretty good set for the time. It was probably the best one that I could find. This was the most expensive one that Sears sold, and I was impressed with it. Unfortunately, it lost a couple of teeth when I was using it in the 1990s. The teeth simply fell off, likely when the saw blade hit a rather rough knot. So both of these teeth have either completely sheared off or are partially sheared off. I've cleaned this blade up, so I'll give this a shot on the saw and see how well it works. The teeth on it have a positive hook angle, and so it's going to be a rather aggressive cut. Now let's take a look at the blade here a little bit further. The other outside blade is in pretty good shape. It has 22 teeth, so that's a pretty high tooth count for a dado blade. The chippers only have 2 carbide teeth on them. Once again, I've got all the pitch from cutting Douglas fir and pine removed from these blades so that we can test this out on the 12-inch radial arm saw that's behind me later on today. I will not be testing out the single blade design, but I'll be testing this one out even though it has 2 missing teeth. Okay, so that's one example of dado blades that you could use on a radial arm saw. I used this successfully in the 1990s on the radial arm saw, although it had a tendency to be a rather aggressive cut that occasionally was problematic. I had this dado stack on the Craftsman radial arm saw the first time the motor mount snapped on that saw. And next we'll take a look at the Freud dado stack that I bought at an auction. This set was roughly about $35 is what the auction price went for. The previous owner had used this dado stack maybe once or twice before he packaged it up to be auctioned off. I have cleared off all the tar pitch that was on the saw teeth. There was only a small amount on the saw teeth. If I can mount this onto the radial arm saw with this huge hub on it, I'll try it out. The teeth have, I believe it's a negative 12-degree hook angle, which would be great on a radial arm saw. And let's see here, the chippers, they go along with this set, have 4 teeth each, so that would yield a nicer looking bottom cut compared with the 2 teeth design of the Craftsman blade. These teeth also have a negative hook angle, and they also have a piece of metal in front of each of the teeth to limit how deep of a cut each tooth can take. So that would slow your feed rate, and that could produce a safer cut. I've heard that this particular design with the piece of metal in front of the teeth is not compatible with the saw stop style saws. So maybe that's the reason why the person got rid of the dado stack. It could also be that this large hub did not allow the dado blade to be mounted onto the saw very well. Because this is so thick, you may not have but maybe 1 or 2 threads of the saw arbor nut engaged, and so that could be a dangerous operation. I'll have to test this out and see whether or not it works on the radial arm saw. Dado stack also comes with an arbor nut wrench that may or may not fit the arbor nut on your saw. I tested this and it does fit the arbor nut on the 12-inch Delta saw that's behind me. So it should also work on a Unisaw's nut on its arbor. And probably some other saws as well. In one of the previous videos of the series, in fact the first video of the radial arm saw series, I showed the Forest Dado King dado blade stack. It was only a partial stack at that time. I now have the outside blades mounted into it. I bought this Dado King dado stack in, I believe it was November of 2001. I'm not sure if they made any redesigns to it, or if it's still exactly the same. The teeth on it have a -5 hook angle on the outside blades, and the outside blades are also angled so that it can do a better job cutting plywood. It's my understanding that the bat ears, which is a little bit of a scribe cut that you get into the corners, is supposed to be less on this Dado King than it is on similar style dado blades. The chippers have 4 teeth, as you can see here, and one of the issues that I've had with this dado stack is that you mount it onto the saw and you can never get seemingly an easy 1/4 inch stack or a 1/2 inch stack or a 3/8 inch stack or a 3/4 inch stack just by simply stacking these 1/8 inch thick chippers between the 2 1/8 inch thick outside blades. This dado stack was developed apparently to be used with metric plywood that you'll find in the stores today, where it's never exactly a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch thick. So this dado stack will actually exactly match the width of those common plywood sizes. And unfortunately, if you have to use a common imperial size, you'll have to go to using shims. This is a shim stack set that I bought from, I believe it was Freud, and unfortunately they rust a little bit. I use a 3/8 inch dado stack on my cabinet saw that I have set up for doing dado blades, and I use that saw for doing things such as cutting box joints. And so I finally figured out that I need a 0.012 inch thick shim along with the dado blades mounted onto that saw, which would include the outside blades and 1/8 inch thick chipper to exactly equal 3/8 of an inch. And I've had some issues with this particular shim in that it doesn't always go flat against the blade. Sometimes it goes on there slightly crooked, and so I end up with a dado stack that might measure 3/8 of an inch on the one side, and then 180 degrees from that, it might measure maybe 1/100th of an inch oversize. And so it's always been a little bit of a problem to get an exact dimension when you're using shims with this particular dado stack. I believe that they now come with a set of magnetic shims that are larger in diameter in the center than 5/8 of an inch, and so they would attach directly onto the saw blade. So we'll be testing this blade out on the radial arm saw, and I mentioned in a previous video that I found that this dado stack is a bit grabby on a radial arm saw, even though it has a negative hook angle for its teeth. So we'll test this out. Okay, and a woodpecker stopped by the house and dropped off another package here for me. This is a woodpecker's dado stack. It does not create flat bottom grooves, so it has the bat ear style design like the Forest. We'll be able to compare this with that Forest dado stack that I bought in 2001. This comes with a set of magnetic shims for shimming it out. I don't know if these will be necessary to reach exactly a 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, 1/2 inch, and 3/4 of an inch, but that's a possibility. The outside blades for this dado stack have 24 teeth, similar to the Forest dado stack. By the way, I haven't seen any reviews for this dado stack. I saw an advertisement on YouTube for it, and I thought, well, I'll give that a shot and see if it works out any better with a radial arm saw. So once again, this has 24 teeth on the outside blades of the dado stack. It does have, I believe it's a 5-degree negative hook on the teeth for the outside blades. And then for the inside blades, it's a little bit different. This is an example of a chipper for this woodpecker's dado stack. This has 12 teeth on it. All of the chippers in the dado stack have 12 teeth, and they're all angled with a positive degree hook angle, so that may make it so that this dado stack is even more grabby on a radial arm saw than is the Forest dado stack. But we can test that out. And interestingly, this stack only includes one 1/16 inch chipper blade, 2/8 inch thick chipper blades, and a 1/4 inch thick chipper blade. So it doesn't have as much variation in thicknesses as you have with the Forest dado stack. And so that could be interesting to see whether or not we're able to achieve as much flexibility as we can get with that Forest dado stack. So let's take another peek through these blades, and let's see if we can get the 1/4 inch thick blade out of the box here. Okay, so here's the 1/4 inch chipper blade. As you can see, it's a quite impressive blade with 12 teeth on it. So it'll be interesting to see how the saw handles this. It seems like with having more teeth on the inside chipper blades, that'll increase the draw, the power requirement on the saw. So I'm not sure how the 1.5 horsepower in the radial arm saw is going to react to the additional stress when we cut various different woods using the dado blades. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at, is to see how these different dado stacks do on this radial arm saw that's right next to me. I'll get some very old Douglas fir that's been drying for over 30 years, and we'll start out with that, and we'll try cutting some tenons in the end of those boards using the dado stacks, and then we'll switch over to some hardwood. Now, this board shows what we're trying to achieve. Here on the end of the board, you can see a tenon that I put onto it roughly 30 years ago using that Craftsman dado blade. And as you can see, not all the chippers are ground to the same width, and so there's a little bit of grooving in the board. It's not a completely flat bottom, but that's the best I could get years and years ago. So I want to put a tenon that's just as long and just as deep as this tenon onto another board that I've got here. This is another Douglas fir board, and it originally had a tenon cut into the end of it 30 years ago, but last fall I chopped that off, thinking that I could reuse this board for some other purpose. So we'll be using it for today's demonstration with the various different dado blades. This board has been stored for over 30 years, so it should be very, very dry at this point. At least as dry as my environment allows. Okay, so I've got the Craftsman dado stack mounted onto here. I've used the setup block to set it so that it's 1 inch off the table. And by the way, I've tried using the Kreg setup blocks for various different things, and I've run out of ideas for actually being able to use these. They're more or less worthless for everything that I've tried to use them for. I guess that was a bad investment. Whereas the other setup blocks that I've been using for various different projects, these seem to be working out pretty well. This has a 1, 2, 3 block in it, and so I can set that underneath the dado stack to set the dado stack 1 inch off the table. Okay, so I've got the dado stack on here. I have the chippers inside, which of course have 2 teeth each. I have those slightly spaced out so that they're not all right next to each other, which should yield a little bit easier cut with this saw. The saw is currently unplugged, so what I'll have to do now is install a different fence board into the saw. I don't want to ruin the near zero clearance that I've got in this fence for a regular saw blade. This is a board that I've used previously with dado stacks. So what I'll do is I'll flip this board end for end and actually cut a new zero clearance on the opposite end of it that I can use with these different dado stacks just to do some testing with. Okay, this fence board that I've got mounted into the saw now is only about 1 inch tall. That would be the absolute minimum that you'd want to use if you're going to be dadoing into boards that are 1.5 inches thick. You want to make sure that your fence is tall enough to provide enough support so that the board that's being cut does not try to rock on the table as it's being cut. That can be a dangerous situation. Also, you want to make sure that you don't use too large of a fence, because I've seen certain situations using, for instance, a red oak board that I had set up for about a 4-inch tall fence, that it actually split in half due to the pressure that gets exerted when a dado stack is used. And so you don't want to have that situation happen where the fence board splits in half while you're using it. Okay, so I'm going to get a stop block set up on the table, and then I'll get started doing the cutting. One other thing to mention here is that with that 3/4 inch wide dado stack on the radial arm saw, I could not use the regular washer that fits at the end of the arbor shaft. I had to actually use the arbor washer from a unisaw in place of this very thick washer. And this thick washer, I believe, is intended to reduce vibration in the blade. I have the stop block set up on the saw so that it'll yield a 1.5 inch long tenon. Hopefully you'll be able to see from this different angle. This blade has 2 missing teeth on the outside, and those 2 missing teeth are on this side of the blade. By putting those 2 missing teeth on the outside like that, I'm hoping that I still get a clean shoulder on the inside here. After I make the one cut going across, I'll have to make a second pass and maybe a third pass on this side, and then flip the board over and do the opposite side the same way. Okay, so here's the resulting cut. It looks like it's probably the right thickness of a 1/2 inch. Let's just verify real quick here. Okay, that is exactly a 1/2 inch, so that's right on target. I did not get a very smooth cut in terms of the bottom. I believe that's because not all those blades were milled accurately to exactly the same diameter. I've got some chip out here on the back side, which is quite common with Douglas fir. I was expecting more resistance when I pulled the dado stack through the board, similar to what I've received recently here with southern yellow pine that's been drying for 15 years. That offers a lot of resistance compared to this Douglas fir. Okay, so I'm going to cut this off. I'll switch over to a different dado blade and we'll continue. Yeah, I have the Freud SD608 dial-a-width dado stack mounted into the radial arm saw now. I have the 2 outside blades and 4 chippers mounted in there. Okay, so now I've just reset the depth of cut for the tenon to 1.5 inches. Got the guard mounted back onto the saw, so we're ready to cut now. This is the first time I've used this Freud dado stack since I bought it years ago at an auction. Okay, so that's not a good sign. The motor can't turn. So what is the problem here? Okay, I'm going to turn it on like that and see if it runs. Okay, so this dado stack is not compatible with this radial arm saw. It must be that the inside of the dado stack was making contact with the blade guard. So we'll move on to the next candidate. Now I have the Forest Dado King blade that I bought in November 2001 mounted into the saw right now. I had to remove the outside washer so that I could get the nut to seat fully onto the end of the arbor. I also had to reset the height of the saw blade so that there's 1 inch between the bottom of the tooth and the saw table. It must be that the Freud set is also taller than 8 inches, whereas this Forest set must be very close to exactly 8 inches like the Craftsman. Okay, so I also had to adjust the position of the stop. I have the 2 outside blades for the Forest Dado King and then 4 chippers mounted into it. Okay, let's go ahead and we'll get started with a cut. That self-fed a little bit more than the other dado blades that we've tried so far. Yeah, that's a 1/2 inch thick, just like we wanted. I only had to make 2 passes with the blade. I was able to do it in 2 passes rather than 3 as with the Craftsman. Here's the quality of the cut. It's not a perfectly flat bottom, but it's very, very close. There's two little grooves right here where the outside blade made a slight V in the board. And that's to limit the amount of chip out. We'll have to compare the depth of that V groove that's cut into the tenon with what's left behind by the woodpecker's dado blade, and we'll do that shortly here. If the forest dado stack with 5° negative hook angle chippers in the center here with only 4 teeth is any indication, this woodpecker's dado stack is going to be extremely grabby, as the chippers on the inside each have 12 teeth. There's a 1/4 inch wide chipper in the center of the stack, and the chippers all have a positive hook angle to them. I'm hoping that I can control the saw when this gets fired up. Okay, I'm going to move the camera back over into the regular position, and then we'll get started. Okay, the new woodpecker's dado blade is ready to go. Okay, surprisingly, this woodpecker's dado stack is less grabby in terms of how much it wants to self-feed than the forest dado stack. I'm really surprised by that, considering the number of teeth and the positive hook angle on this dado stack for the chippers. It's giving a very flat bottom, which is great. The little bat wings left by the outside blades do appear like they're deeper than what's found on the forest dado stack's results. I'll cut this end piece off and then we can compare them side by side. Okay, so here's the comparison of the quality of the cut. This is the Craftsman dado stack that has 2 missing outer teeth on the one blade that was running on the outside here, and it does a pretty nice job. It had some chip out, especially back here, and it was making the cut. As you can see here, this is pretty much vertical grain Douglas fir, so this is probably about the best that you could hope for. It did a nice job. It was not grabby at all, which is really surprising. In other words, it did not try to self-feed when I was in the cut. I have had situations in the past where it's tried to self-feed cutting through Douglas fir, but not through this wood. This outside cut here was done using a Forest Woodworker 2 blade, so you can see the amount of chip out that you're getting in comparison with a dado stack. Okay, so comparing the Craftsman with the Forest blade, here you can see that the Forest blade has a very small groove here in the center. That's due to the outside blades and the slate bat ear or cat ear that they leave to limit the amount of chip out in plywood. So that's all around a very good cut. I don't see any chip out really in the Douglas fir. And once again, that blade was purchased in November of 2001, and it's still in pretty good shape. It wasn't used extensively, but the teeth are clean on it. Okay, in comparison to the forest blade, here's the woodpecker's blade result. And as you can see, this is a very smooth, flat bottom, just like with the forest blade. It does have a more pronounced bat ear in the bottom here where the outside blade made contact than what you see with the forest. Woodpeckers does offer a dado set that has a completely flat bottom, but those were out of stock at this time. And here you can see the comparison of the Woodworker 2 blade being used for doing a crosscut. It left quite a bit of chip out compared with the result of the Woodpecker's dado blade. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to using some hardwood. If I switch over to using 3/4 inch thick hardwood, I'll have to put some other board on top of the radial arm saw table because this saw is not able to get within 3/8 of an inch of the table using an 8-inch dado stack. I have a piece of red oak here. It's 1 15/16 of an inch thick, 5 1/4 inches wide. I have the dado blade set to make a 3/4 inch deep pass, 3/4 of an inch wide, and I'll be making an area here that's cut out 1.5 inches wide. I'm going to start at the full depth of cut. I want to see how much self-feeding action I get out of this new Woodpecker's dado blade that I've got installed in here at 3/4 of an inch depth and 3/4 of an inch width, as if we're trying to do a half lap in a board that's 1.5 inches thick. Okay, so this cut appears to be pretty smooth. For reference, the end cut on here was done using a Forest Chopmaster blade. The edge here was done using a 24 tooth Ridge Carbide rip blade. And this tenon looks pretty nice. You can see in here quite clearly a deep V-groove from the outside dado blade on both sides. Other than that, it looks pretty nice. We got a little bit of chip out right here, but it looks pretty nice other than that. So I'm going to take this over to the other radial arm saw, chop it off, and then we'll switch over to the Forest Woodworker 2 dado stack. And you probably noticed that I was getting quite a bit of self-feeding out of this blade, and that was kind of expected due to the number of teeth that are there. Based on the previous test using the Douglas fir board, I'm expecting the Forest Dado King dado blade to even self-feed more than that. You do want to make sure that you're stiff arming it, as you saw me doing, and as it started running through the cut, automatically I was pushing it back. I have the Forest dado stack mounted back into the saw, at 3/4 of an inch width. I did not have to adjust the saw's height, so apparently the diameter of this forest blade is identical to the diameter of the woodpecker's blade. So we're ready to get started here. What I'm going to do, since this board out here that's acting as a stop is only 3/4 of an inch thick, I'll make the cut at the full depth, flip the board over, make a cut again at full depth, and then we'll come back and we'll clean up the outside edge here. You may have noticed that when I was doing the cut, I made one pass, and then when I made the second pass, there was a little bit left over here on the end. To clear out that remaining bit, I just ran the saw in the opposite direction. You can do that when you're doing dado cuts like this, as long as you're not taking out a full width pass. It would be safe. Now, in my opinion, this time the forest dado stack was not as grabby as the woodpecker's dado stack. I could be mistaken. They were very close. I'm happy with the result here. I did get a bit of tear out here that I was not expecting, but otherwise it's a pretty good cut. Okay, I'll chop this off at the radial arm saw and we'll switch over to the Craftsman blade and see how it does. I have the Craftsman dado stack mounted back into the saw, set to 3/4 of an inch wide. I had to slightly adjust the height of the blade, which kind of indicates that it may not be exactly 8 inches in diameter, unlike the forest and the woodpecker's blade. I also had to adjust the position of the stop. I'm not quite sure why I had to do that, but it was off by about 1/16 of an inch. Okay, so we're ready to make a cut, and I'll do the same thing that I did the last time. I'll make a full depth cut, flip the board over, make another full depth cut on the other side, and then we'll take care of this piece on the outside here. Once again, the outside blade that has the missing teeth is on this side of the saw, so hopefully that'll control chip out. Let's see how much self-feeding we have with this particular dado blade. Okay, so there was less of a self-feeding problem with this old Craftsman blade than with either the woodpeckers or the forest blade. I'm not sure if that's because the chippers only have 2 teeth, or if the blade's just simply dull, and so it doesn't try to feed as aggressively. Here you can see that the quality of the cut is nowhere near as good as that of the other 2 dado stacks that we looked at. I'll cut this off, and then we'll compare the 3 results. Yeah, the results are shown here. We have the forest blade results. This cut here was made with a Forest Chopmaster blade. As you can see, we got a very clean cut all the way around. Got a little bit of a grooving problem in the forest blade results. The forest blade was slightly grabby. Pretty much what we saw when it was cutting the Douglas fir. I was surprised. I was thinking that it would be quite a bit worse than what it was. It did a really nice job with this portion here. Very little chip out all the way around. The woodpecker's result looks roughly the same as the forest. For some reason on the forest we had a little bit of a ridge right here, and I'm not sure what caused that. But we did not get the same result with the woodpecker's dado blade. The woodpecker's blade cutting this red oak was pretty much as grabby as was the forest, where I had to hold the saw carriage back so that it didn't try to advance too quickly. The results here are just as clean as the forest, which I'm very happy about. The Craftsman blade, surprisingly, was the least grabby of the group. And even though that has a forward rake on all of its teeth, and that very well could be because the teeth on that dado blade are quite dull, or potentially quite dull, because of how old the dado blade is. And so maybe that's reduced the amount of grabbiness that type of a saw blade produces. Either that or it's a 2 teeth per chipper that's reduced the grabbiness. Hey, I am happy with the forest results. I'm disappointed that it did not come with any kind of blade carrier other than a cardboard box. So I'll have to see if I can get a carrier like what came with the forest dado stack or something similar, so that I can store that blade set easily. Hey, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.